Welcome to my Windows Presentation Foundation Brushes and Colors course. Join me as I continue my series, this time exploring the painting system included in the WPF framework. I start with a look at the WPF brushes and point out what parts of the WPF UI are brushable. I'll explore how color works, especially in conjunction with the solid color and gradient brushes. You'll see how to specify color with a set of predefined colors, with RGB values, through hexadecimal notation, and via the sRGB color space. Check out the section on the Visual Studio Property Editor. This handy tool provides visualization of the colors and brushes, making it easy to define the look you want. Once the color basics are mastered, I focus on the available brushes. There is a section on gradient brushes and one on the image brush. I investigate opacity masks and look at how to create interesting effects with the visual brush. Finally, I close the course with a demonstration on how to store brushes and colors in XAML resources. So what should you know before beginning this course? This course is part of an ongoing multi-part series about Windows Presentation Foundation, Microsoft's newest and most flexible desktop application framework. I'll be working with the WPF projects in Visual Studio, which means I'll spend the majority of the course working inside the Visual Studio application. Therefore, some experience with Visual Studio, the full-featured Microsoft Developer IDE, is a plus. In this course, I'll be working with Visual Studio 2015. The WPF tools are also available for Visual Studio 2013 and earlier versions. To be clear, 2015 has the best WPF tools, so I recommend you get a copy. The free Community Edition has all the tools you need for this course. I suggest you install the latest updates for Visual Studio 2015. At this time, that is Update 3. There are a number of courses available to help you learn how to work with Visual Studio. This playlist is available on our site. It lists all the Visual Studio 2015 courses in our catalog. The example application code for the course is C#, so naturally I'll be working with solutions and projects that contain code. I usually program in C#, so that's the language I'll use in the course. I assume that you know .NET and C#. For this course, a competence in .NET types and type members like properties and events is helpful. If you want to learn more about C#, there is a playlist on our website that lists all the relevant C# courses. WPF uses XAML, Microsoft's extensible application markup language. It's my opinion that all competent WPF developers should understand XAML and be comfortable reading and writing it during development. If you are new to XAML, check out my XAML series. It's a good primer to watch before taking this course. In that series, I look at key principles like XAML-based properties and events. I look at object elements and how XAML maps to the .NET type system. I explore markup extensions, type converters, resources, and resource dictionaries. Plus, I investigate the new dependency and attached property system. This system provides key benefits that make control templates and data binding work in WPF. Finally, XAML is based on XML, so that suggests that you should have a basic understanding of XML. If XML is new to you, I suggest you search our site for some courses to help you learn this important markup language. The minimum knowledge you need is understanding XML namespaces, elements, and attributes. Visual Studio includes a WPF-specific debugging tool that shows up as an overlay on your application UI when you're debugging an application. I will not be using it during the course, so in this video, I'll show you how to disable it so your debugging UI looks the same as mine. Here's what the UI looks like I'm talking about. I'll run this application, and this black bar here with these buttons is the debugging toolbar. It's a very useful tool, but I won't be using it during this course. You can see it will interfere with my UI, where it covers up part of my UI. So I want to disable this toolbar. Go to Tools, Options, click on Debugging, and then General. It's this section here, Enable UI Debugging Tools for XAML. And there's a check mark here for Show Runtime Tools in Application. So we'll uncheck that, click on OK, rerun the application, and you'll see that that debugging toolbar is now disabled. If you are a member of lynda.com or LinkedIn Learning, you have access to the exercise files used throughout this title. The files are in a folder named Exercise Files. Put this folder in a location that makes sense for your computer. This is how I organized my copy. I have a courseware folder on my C drive, then a child folder for each course that has exercises. This one is named WPF04, and here's my exercise files folder. In order to use the exercises in the folder, you'll have to have Visual Studio 2015 installed. I encourage you to install the latest update for Visual Studio, which is called Update 3. Each chapter is numbered. I'll open Chapter 4. If there's an exercise available for a video in this chapter, you'll find a matching numbered folder. I'll take a look in video number 2. This is the Start folder for the project. In some videos, there's also a Done folder containing the final version of the project created in the video. I'll open the Start folder. Here you'll see there's a folder that has an SLN extension. This is a solution file. You can double-click on this to launch Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, I click on the Solution Explorer and I can see my solution and my project. After the project is open, I encourage you to build the project using the Build menu. This ensures that the project is up to date and ready to use in the course. Now that you've seen how to open the exercise files, let's get started. I think it's a good idea to start this course by talking about the classes and structures that we'll see throughout the course. I'm talking about the brushes and the colors. In WPF, when you want to paint an area of the screen, you use a brush. All the brushes in WPF derive from this abstract class called brush. You'll find that many of the elements that you use in your UI have properties that are typed as brush. For instance, the rectangle has a fill property that is typed brush. And what that means is that you can take any of these derived classes and paint that area of the screen using those particular brushes. The most common brush that you'll see in WPF is this one, the solid color brush. Use this brush when you want to paint an area of a screen with a single color. Now you can take a look at the brush itself and you see that it only has one interesting property, the color property. The base class has a couple of interesting properties, like the opacity value. I'll talk about opacity and transparency a little bit later in the course. This is also where you can specify what are called transformations of the brush. There are some other brushes in WPF that work with colors. I'm showing them here. They're called gradient brushes, and there's two of them. Linear gradient brush and radial gradient brush, and both of these derive from this abstract class gradient brush. You use a gradient brush when you want to paint an area of the screen with bands of color. So you'll see that in the gradient brush abstract class, there's a property called gradient stops. And if I look at the gradient stop class, which goes in that collection, you'll see that it has a property called color and a property called offset. This is where you specify the color for the band. Then you specify in the linear gradient brush the starting and end points of the linear gradient brush, and then how many bands you want, or how many gradient stops. And then in the radial gradient brush, you would specify the property like the center. Radial gradient brushes use it when you want to have rings of color. Speaking of color, there are many classes and types that work with color, and I'm showing them on this class diagram too. This is the one you'll look at first. It's called the color struct. And you see it has properties like A, B, G, and so on. Think of the color structure as a way of building a color. You can supply the blue channel or the green channel and have it build up the color and then use that color and assign it to the color property. If you'd rather not build it up yourself, you can use the colors class, which is filled with predefined colors. WPF also supports a concept of color profiles. You use the color context class to set profiles using the profile URI. The color converter is useful when you have a string value in your XAML and you want to convert that string value into the actual color class. And in relationship to that, there's also something called a brush converter, which works very similarly. You take a string value in your XAML and it turns it into a brush. I'll talk about the difference between those as we go through the course. What we've seen on this screen, on this class diagram, are all of the color-related classes. And if you worked in some other UI frameworks, you may be familiar with the color values for setting properties. WPF uses a more sophisticated system. Remember I said you have this base class here? Let's go take a look at some of the other classes that derive from this. They're called tile brushes. They're over here in this class diagram. The tile brush derives from the abstract brush class. And the idea behind the tile brush is when you want to paint with a pattern on the screen. The most common brush that you'll see used in the tile brushes is this one, the image brush. You'll specify an image source, and then when you paint with that brush, it'll use the pixels from that image. If you've worked in WPF at any length of time, you've seen the image element. That's for putting an image on the screen. the image brush takes the data from that image and uses that to paint part of the screen. So you can repeat the image many places on the screen without having to have multiple images. You'll find in the tile brush base class properties like viewbox and tile mode and stretch. This is where you specify how the repeating pattern will work. And then one of the really fascinating areas in WPF is these other two brushes, the visual brush and the drawing brush. The visual brush allows me to pick a visual from the visual tree and then paint with that. What I could do here is I could pick an image element on my visual tree and set that as my visual. There's a property in here called visual. I would point that to my image, and then I basically created an image brush. It's taking the image and it's painting with that. So you probably won't do that. You'll use the image brush instead. But what if I picked a different element in the tree? What if I picked a button? If I picked the button and said, that's my visual, now I can start painting with the pixels that are typically shown on the button. And the most common use for this is to create things like a reflection. Or what if I have a video player? There's something called a media element. What if I put a media element on the screen in my visual tree, and I tell my visual brush to use the pixels that are being painted in the media element? Now when the video is playing, I can paint other parts of my screen with that video. Finally, there's something called the drawing brush. The idea of drawing is that there are certain classes in WPF that are drawing related, or think of them as shapes, lines, ellipses, rectangles, and things like that. So I could build a drawing out of a group of shapes and then assign that collection of shapes to my drawing brush. And now I can start painting my screen with the pixels that are rendered from that drawing. So I could take a circle and put another concentric circle inside of that and another circle inside that. Now I've got a bullseye, and then I can use that as a paintbrush to paint other parts of my screen. I'll show a few examples of the types of brushes you can use in WPF. I'll be using this mainwindow.xaml file, and I'll take a look briefly at the UI. So I've got these different elements on the screen. For instance, I've got this grid, and I'm setting its background property. The background property is a brushable property. So I've set that here, and I'll manipulate it in code by clicking on these different buttons. So I've got the background. I've also got this, which is called a border. So there's a border that's around this image, and I'm setting its border brush property. Then I have this section of the UI, which is called the header grid. It's another grid, and I'll be changing its background property. And then finally, I have these ellipses in this area of the screen, and I'll be changing the fill property. That's also another brushable property. The way this works is each of these buttons applies a different brush. So we'll take this first button and click on it, and we'll apply a solid color brush to parts of the UI. So here I've changed the background, I've changed this border, and I've changed this to a white color, and then these two different values of orange. With a gradient brush, we can apply bands of color. Here I've got a radial gradient brush on the background. It's got a light color in the center, which is underneath this image, and then it's radiating out towards the corners of the UI. Here I used a linear gradient brush, and the effect I was going for is a light color in the middle. The gradients are moving from the top to the bottom. I have a light color around the text, and then on the edges, I've got a darker color. On the ellipses, I have a gradient brush. This is a radial gradient brush, and I've got two different effects here. On the middle one, I'm using exactly the same brush type that I did here in the background. I've got a center color and an outside color. On these two ellipses, I'm using a radial gradient brush, but I've set some properties on it so that I've got a cone-shaped gradient here that's starting at a tiny point here in the center and radiating out in this cone angle. Next, we'll look at the image brush. The image brush takes an image and paints it in other areas of the screen. In this case, I've set the background of the main grid to an oil painting. I've changed the border brush on the main border to an image, an abstract image. For this grid, I picked an image of a folded piece of paper. And then finally, for these ellipses, I picked a round-shaped image so I can get this gray background. This actually gray background here is coming from the image, and then I've got this shape here in the center. Now, the image brush is a tile brush. Here's another example. This is an image brush that's applied to the background here. And the way tiled brushes work is you specify a size. Here, I've got a small version of this image. The same image is here in the center. I've got a small version of that, and then it's tiling or repeating itself. So it's repeated here and here, and it's also repeated horizontally across the screen. The nice thing about the tile brush is I can change the size of this rectangle. If I make it really small, I'd have lots of copies of this image. If I make it really big, I might only have one or two. The image brush is also flippable. So when I specify a tile brush, I can specify whether I do exact replicas of each picture when it's going in the column and rows, or I can flip it as it goes horizontally on the x-axis or vertically. And that gives me this kaleidoscope effect. And what I've done here is I've also tied it to a mouse move event handler. So when I move my mouse over the center image, I'm changing the size of the original rectangle. This gives me this nice kaleidoscope effect. Speaking of nice effects, let's look at the visual brush. Visual brushes allow me to pick some part of the visual UI that's showing on the screen and use that as a brush. What I did here is I have a media element that was invisible, and I made it visible, and it's playing a video, and then I made a brush out of this media element. And then I painted the insides of the ellipses with that brush, and I also painted the border brush on the main border. Now in this case, the video has stopped playing, and you'll see that the last frame of the video is showing on those areas. This shows that you can have various effects with the brushes. You can use many various brushes, and you can get some really rich UI in your application. I want to look at the properties on the various WPF elements that are brushable. By that, I mean ones that you can instantiate a WPF brush and assign to that property. I use the term brushable. That's one that I use. It's not an official WPF term. To make this happen, I'm using this brushable solution. And what I want to do is run the application and have it docked to the left side of the screen. I've already docked Visual Studio to the right side of the screen. To bring up the brushable executable, I'll right-click on the project. Oh, before I do that, I'll go up here and click on Show All Files. Then I'll go to Bin, Debug. Right-click on the Debug folder and choose this item, Open Folder in File Explorer. Now, while File Explorer has focus, I'll hold down the Window key and press the left arrow. Then I'll run this brushable.exe. If you don't see any files in this folder, remember you have to build the project in Visual Studio. On another note, I've got additional files in here that you won't see in your folder. They are artifacts from prior builds on my computer. And do the same thing. Here I'll hold down the Window key and do the left arrow. Now I can see the application and also see my code. Well, I need to do one more thing to see my code. I'll unpin the Solution Explorer. What I'm looking at is the different properties on the elements that are of type brush. As you learn WPF, you'll get a feeling for which of these properties you can set brushes on. For example, here's the main grid, and it has a background property. But did you know that? Did you know that that was a property? Now you can find out by hovering over this, and it'll tell you that the type of this property is system.windows.media.brush. Or another way you can do this is right-click, choose Peak Definition, and Visual Studio will pull up this inside window with the values in there. Here you can see it's of type brush. Now you're not going to want to do this all the time, so what you'll do is you'll learn which properties are brushable. What I found is if you're new, you may not know all the properties, and even if you're a veteran, you may not know all of the properties on the WPF elements that are brushable. So what I've done is I've created this application, and it's showing a list box here of the various elements that have properties of type brush. And when you click on one of them, let's say I click on this border here, over in this list box, I'm showing the properties with that type. So the border has 3 properties that you can apply a brush to: background, border brush, and opacity mask. I'll talk about opacity and masks later in this chapter. So what you can do is hit the up and down arrow and scroll through this list and see all the various properties that are brushable. Usually there's one called background and border brush, but let's check out the ellipse. There it is. The ellipse, instead of having a background property, has a fill property, and it has a stroke property. And the stroke represents the border that goes around the outside edge of the ellipse. Let's look at another one here. There's one called data grid. This one has a lot of properties. So it has background and border brush, but it also has alternating row background and one for horizontal grid lines and one for vertical grid lines. So the point is you can use this to familiarize yourself with the various brushable properties. Let's take a quick look at the code and how I made this application. I'm using some reflection code, and I'm using some LINQ queries. I don't need this app anymore, so I'll close that, and then I'll maximize Visual Studio so it's easier to see the code. Here's the example. This fills the first list box. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting one of the WPF assemblies called Presentation Framework. I'm using a version 4.0 that you'll find in most computers. And then once I have the assembly, I load it here. Then I use LINQ down here to get all the types out of that assembly where they're public. And then I look through all the properties, and I look for properties that are type brush. And I'll put all of the matching classes in this list box. Then when you click on one of those items, I run this code. The selection changed event handler fires. And what I do here is I get the current selected item's type. Let's say it's the ellipse. Then I get all the properties from that, and I do a where clause on that where I say the property has to be of type brush. It's just that simple. So now you have an application you can run at any time to find out the brushable properties of any WPF class. In this example, I'll look at how to apply a brush to a brushable property. The brush I'll be working with is the solid color brush because that's the most common brush you encounter in WPF. In this first example, I'll write the solid color brush and apply it in C# code. Later in this chapter, I'll show you how to do the same thing in XAML. And for the item that I'm going to apply the brush to, I'll work with some ellipses. I picked ellipses because they're simple. They have a fill property and a stroke property that can have a brush applied. It's a simple concept, but everything I show you in this video also applies to any of the other brushable properties on any of the other elements. The ellipses are not visible on the screen unless you mouse over them. It's either here, and I'll click, and you can see the ellipse appear. The other way to make them appear is to go to your XAML editor, find them in the editor, and click on them. You get the sizing handles and the design time adornments because Visual Studio wants you to see it even if they're not visible on the finished application. And the reason they're not visible is because at the moment they don't have any brushes applied to them, so they're transparent. I'll fix that by writing some C# code. So I'll switch over to the code behind for this main window.xaml. I have two event handlers in here. This first one, I'll apply a solid color brush to the fill property, and in the second event handler, I'll apply it to the stroke property. I'll start by creating a variable of type solid color brush. Now that I got my brush, I will go to its color property and assign a color value. There's a variety of ways I can make a color. For this first example, I'll use a set of predefined colors that are in the WPF API. And then I have my brush. I'll go to my ellipse, its fill property, and assign the brush. And now we'll run the application and see if it works. So the entire center portion of the ellipse is painted with that one color. As you know, in code, there's usually more than one way of accomplishing a task, and it's no different here. I'll create another brush. I'll go back here. I've got this code. This is the